listening pauses, I invite you to share through the chat the sounds or other subsonic vibrations that have entered or become prominent in your landscape that you have noticed, that can be heard or felt in your place. And as for me, I mostly hear birds here, magpies, galahs, blue wrens, red brow finches, New Holland honeyeaters, rosellas. Faintly, I hear the high-pitched whining of my son's golden cocker spaniel Lightning as he protests at being ushered outside to create some buffer between us and his joyful barking. I also hear an occasional scratching in the ceiling, which I hope is our resident Fasker Gail and not mice, which can be the case. I've heard my son Zeno trying to open the door, he's 9, noisily creeping back and forth. And I guess, I mean, he may need something, but I suspect it's actually a complex message which is directed at me, that he is making an explicit effort to be quiet so that I can value and appreciate the web of accommodations that he and the rest of the extended family make. And so I can continue working during our co-located COVID isolation. And I hear the whirring of my laptop and feel the warmth radiating from it, working too hard as it struggles to process the electrical signals that are needed to translate and carry my words and your words back and forth. Let me dive into the chat here and also acknowledge the Turrbal and the Yugara people. Kia ora, Nolwenn from Tamaki Makarau, and from Erin, the Kaurna people as well. It's something that I've been thinking a lot about in terms of the acknowledgement of country when we're dealing with sound, and how we can acknowledge that it's not only the supportive infrastructure of the place that we sit, although that certainly sustains and benefits us, but through sound we reach out to many places that we do not know in an embodied way. But here we have in the chat now Gulajang country, we have Gadigal and Bijigal country, and we are here all connected through the virtues of technology. I have an admission to make, which is that I have a habit of stumbling through invited talks, of following trails of thought that might seem promising in the moment, but might also peter out. So I give you fair warning that you may hear me circling themes and never quite making my way to the point. And again, to dive into the chat, I acknowledge the Yalukit William people of the Kulin Nation. Thank you, Susan. Some of you who know me well or know my practice well at least, may be sitting there thinking, oh, I know what comes next. Because here's the moment in a talk where I must confess that my stumbling is deliberate, that I approach each occasion like this as an opportunity to experiment with stumbling blindly or blundering. And that's because blundering is a method that I've been working with as a way to claim the radical agency of blindness, as a way to structure, or more accurately unstructure, lectures, talks, writing, performative movement, compositions. For the sake of you also who do not know me well, I am not legally blind, but I do have complex low vision. I have an extreme myopia or short-sightedness. I have an instability of vision that embraces halos and hallucinations, peripheral distortions, color shifts, absences in my visual field, and a gradual but persistent progression towards more and more extreme perceptual difference from the norm. For the past 5 years, I've been centering my disability within my creative practice, which has propelled me into new terrains of thinking and making, including some interactions with technology, mostly sonic or subsonic. Technology not for technology's sake, but as part of an exploration of sensory and perceptual translations, of wayfinding interior and exterior architectures, and speculative messaging to post-human species. So before I dive into a rapid and randomized slideshow blog blundering around my website as a way of sharing fragments of practice, I want to return to the chat for a moment to thank Penelope, who notes an abundance of crickets and a car go past on a faraway road. Thank you, Penelope. So let's see what we can find here on my website. Now, what I did this morning in order to make this accessible to deaf audiences is that I created a transcript, which is now sitting on my 3ply website, which is what I signed at the beginning. And also to make it accessible, I've created a list of links. So I dumped randomly a bunch of links through into my website that I thought might be interesting for us to explore today. So this one, how does a straight line feel? is an experiment that I undertook at City Gallery in Wellington, in Pornicky, in Aotearoa recently. Let me see if I can play a little of this for you. And maybe while it's loading, to let you know that this came out of a development with a blind dancer, Holly Craig. And I'll just get just listening here. And Holly and I were interested in how we could experiment with performative movement, a duet involving the two of our canes. And then I took that experiment and worked with Brian Phillips, who's a sound artist that I've been collaborating with, to develop a score that responded to field recordings around the hills in Pornicky. There are lines of invited audience that was invited to sit within the quadraphonic system. And the only requirement was that they would hum when I approached, since I wouldn't know where they were. Fortunately for me, because it was an incredible experience to perform, there were many musicians who chose to take those seats within the performative field. And so it was an opportunity to experience a wayfinding and blundering that also involved relating to lines of harmonics that would appear as I approached different audience members. I'll pause that there just to note also that on this site, there's a live audio's description by Essie Iris Nyemi. And Essie is an artist who I invited to describe my performance through Mixlr, so live social radio. And we'll see if this will play.
I'm surrounded by people.
So it's a little muffled, but you can hear that through the site if you're interested. And one of the reasons I wanted to bring that up today, and it's really wonderful that Maddie is here in the chat. She's talking about young adults talking quietly with each other as they write their futures on their laptops nearby. And we also have Sarah Rowbottom talking about the persistent thudding of a jackhammer in a property next door. Maddie and Sarah were organisers of a workshop about how sound matters that I was planning to be involved in. And I was planning to take this piece, How Does a Straight Line Feel, to that workshop to try and resolve some issues I've had with sounding and recording the cane, particularly during a live performance in a way that doesn't disrupt movement. And so greetings to you, Sarah and Maddie, and hopefully I'll have an opportunity to continue to work with them, even though that particular event was cancelled due to COVID. Let me go on now. I've been experimenting with the cane in a variety of performances. This one was at the Contemporary Jewish Museum in San Francisco. And it was a performance that involved public participation, again through scores, inviting, wayfinding. I used an oversized sculptural cane that was made by a blind artist from California, Jennifer Justice. And we had a number of people using mobility canes, spoons, different kinds of devices, including an ultrasonic device that actually my stepfather had designed in the 1970s because he was a renowned inventor of reading and writing devices for the blind. So this was a particular wayfinding performance. And I'm not somebody who's used to performance, but the more that I've been drawn into this practice, the more I found myself in unfamiliar territory. Let me acknowledge here from Bianca the hum of my husband's voice in the meeting in the front room, the whir of an oven basket, the rustle of breeze through leaves outside. Yes, and if you actually, on that Savisa Galactic site, if you actually, I'll just go back there for a moment, a lot of these sites, they have an audio embedded if you're interested in investigating later. I will warn you that it's pretty excruciating because actually that ultrasonic device, I don't know how people manage to wayfind with it, to be honest. It's pretty intense. Let's go on now to this show from 2017, which was in Casula Powerhouse in Sydney. And I think one of the things that's interesting about this one is not only that, again, you know, I found an opportunity to experiment with canes, But it was a moment where we invited two ongoing collaborators of mine, Janaline Wolfe and Ben Phillips, who are actors from the Theatre of the Blind, to come into the show at a time when the gallery was closed to the public. It was after hours, it was in the dark. We were kind of surrounded by the mythologies of hauntings that are in that powerhouse. And we created our audio descriptive recordings in that private space. And one of the reasons is that I've been trying to figure out how we can remove ourselves from the spectatorship of blindness. So this was an experiment in that. It was also a moment where I first exhibited some tactile paintings. And during that night, Brian Phillips put a contact mic on one of the paintings so that Ben and Janaline could not only feel them through their faces, as Janaline was keen on, but also listen to the sounds of those works. And that's led into a whole series of works, including this work, Reading Sequence, Tactile Recall. So this is creating paintings that are carved out of granite rock and also using charcoal to change the feel and therefore the sound properties of some of the materials. And this was actually also in relation to thinking about the experience of a Richard Serra work at SF MoMA, which is another line of work that I've been doing. And I thought it could be of interest in terms of a very simple use of technology that actually has a profound shift in the way that we can sense works. Because in this case, each of these contact mics is actually connected to a common Zoom recorder. So very lo-fi really. But what it means is that you're not only hearing the sounds of your own touching of the paintings, but the collective sounds of three people's encounters. So that's a line of work that I'm interested in pursuing further. I showed those same paintings at a, actually not in this version. This was a development that I undertook at the jail. There's Uncle Rick, Judge Overrung Elder, smoking the jail. And it was an exploration of the sensory policing that occurs in those kinds of spaces. And I did a couple of developments there. This is the second one. And this one, I had the tactile paintings on the wall. Janaline came down from Sydney again to experiment with the space. But also I'd invited over Andy Slater, who was in that Contemporary Jewish Museum performance with me. Now he's a sound artist from Chicago, who's also the founder of the Society of Visually Impaired Sound Artists. And that is particularly relevant because he took field recordings of that experience and created a sound work of himself. No, that's another one, sorry. Where is this? He created this one. He created a sound work of himself wayfinding around the gallery. And then subsequently, I worked with deaf dancer Anna Seymour and a whole variety of others, including Auslan interpreters Ilana Gelbart, deaf artist Jacob Campbell, to try and figure out how we could turn the sound work of Andy wayfinding this jail that had been used for sensory policing into a translation for deaf audiences through the gestural poetics and choreography of profoundly deaf dancer Anna Seymour. So that resulted in a work, Shape of an Echo, which was recently in the Incinerator Award for Social Change exhibition. I think we're ticking on, so I might just try and go to one more. Let's see what else we have here. Let's go here. No, maybe two more. This one is one of my projects, Ascending Sonic Shadows. If you're on my website and you're interested, I've got a variety of projects here, including my publishing initiative and others. And the first one, Relocating Echoes, will take you to this, this site here. And what it is an experiment in creating a hybrid archive, exhibition space and publication platform. It's collaboration with Brian Phillips. And it's really extending our experiments in how audio description can function as an ekphrastic medium for sharing intimate encounters with artworks with an expanded audience. So we've only created the first presentation so far, and this one, let me just play a little. This is actually an encounter with an artwork by Bill Fontana that was installed in the atrium of SF MoMA. And I created an ascending score for that experience, in which we all started listening on the ground floor and slowly worked our way up the museum according to a score based on echolocation. So here is how the audio description sounds.
I'm also noticing on the ground the reflection of the tile. You can see the oculus or the end of the bridge and the moving panels of the speakers.
I want to point out that if we literally took about 2 steps, you'd be running into the old...
They gradually progress up to the oculus, and what happens over time, which is described a little bit down here, is that there's this kind of debate over people experiencing the sound work now versus when it was first installed, and that kind of gap in the experiences. And it turns out to be related to the ways that Fontana is sampling the sounds of water in the pipes. Now, I know that I'm almost up. I've had my text message and I've registered that. So let me jump down to the end. I was going to mention to you another work from the National, which was based on the vocabulary of a cotton plant and a subsonic composition that relied on an earthquake simulator. So it ran parallel to an audio composition and added complexity to what was heard and also what was felt through vibration. So that was another experiment with Brian Phillips, and it was based on a story of communication between humans, or how communication between humans and future humans could draw from the experience of communication between plant and animal species. But since we don't have time for that, I will jump right down to the end, because I want to take a minute to thank you who've been involved in responding to my invitation. Thank you who have allowed this time to be more conversational. And on that, I thank Olivia, who noted the reversing beep of a truck and a happy wattle bird. And I want to close not with a conclusion, but a trailing thread, a stepping forward into precarious territory. And that I want to say something that could be a bit difficult, but I think that it's important to close on a radical vulnerability and to share something that I've been finding troubling in these COVID moments. Since I have this audience listening, and since you've been so warm in responding, and hi, I'm Mol from Jaipur, India, who has a melange of in-house kitchen sounds, the tempering of vegetables, hissing sounds by pressure cookers, intermittent interactions between utensils during cooking, filling of water in a tumbler, and an exhaust fan. And in this moment where we're finding this possibility of connection through this technology, I want to say that I'm also finding a lot of emails about interim online programming to be very triggering. And I'm also finding moments where people are lamenting a longing to go back to business as usual when the art world is very triggering. I think this is a moment for galleries and others to recognize that places and programming have been inaccessible to many, many people. People who've lived with radical vulnerability since before COVID, who live constantly and systemically with physical and social isolation, with poverty, with being broke and jobless, with trauma, with grief, with sickness, with disability, with immune compromises, with remoteness, with parenting or other caregiving without help or respite, with no safe public transport, and a myriad of other circumstances that have made traveling to exhibitions and openings implausible at best and often, frankly, impossible. So this is an opportunity to rethink how the virtual and digital could be better deployed, to invite us into your community regularly, to create structures for the future and not just at this irregular time. So when you email that during COVID, you're going to make your film free and accessible online, that you're going to temporarily invite remote commissions, that you're going to open your discussion series to remote dial-ins, that you're going to make your print book available as a screen reader friendly PDF just for this unprecedented pandemic era, I want to point out that this is like having an invitation to exclusion dangled and then ripped away. And I want to ask, why just during COVID? And I guess really I want to urge you to resist returning to ableist and elitist structures and to allow the technological tremors of this moment to open new radical propositions for access. And with that, I close. And I thank you all for this opportunity to be with you today. And I invite you to listen carefully as Gail continues. And I look forward to connecting with you further. Thank you.
Fayen, thanks so much, and great call to action, you know, in terms of your reminder of the things that we might learn during this period, that we might carry them forward into the future. So as Nikki said, there'll be the opportunity to type in your questions after we hear from our next speaker, Gail Priest, who's based in Katoomba in Sydney and has a multifaceted practice in which sound is the key material of communication and investigation. Focused on encouraging intensive engagement with the aural, she variously employs voice, machine noise, harmonic material, text and video to explore the liminal zone between figuration and abstraction. She's exhibited her sound-based media installations nationally and internationally, most recently as part of Experimenta Makes Sense, currently touring. And she performs semi-improvised electronic music, and releases can be found on her own label, Metal Bitch, as well as Flaming Pines and Endgame Records. She's curated exhibitions and concerts and written extensively about sound and media arts for Real Time magazine. She also founded the site Audible Women, highlighting the work of female identifying artists working with sound. So please, Gail, over to you.
Hi. Wow, back in the world. Great. Thank you very much, Fayen. That was really fantastic and inspiring, and now basically a little bit intimidating. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm hoping you're all seeing my you're seeing my PowerPoint here, I'm hoping. I can't actually see a chat screen now, so if I can't see any mouse activity, so we'll just go with that. And if you can't see it, maybe Nikki, send me a text. I'm titling my my talk to you today "Non-Isolated Soundings," and I would like to reiterate. Oh, Nikki is sending me a text.
We can
and
see
yes,
it. It's all good, Gail.
Great. I would also like to acknowledge that I'm currently sitting on the land of the Darug and Gundungurra people, which is actually the land around Katoomba and the Blue Mountains, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Some people may know that I actually didn't initially start out as a sound artist, and in fact I met Jonathan Parsons many years ago back at the performance space when I was an aspirational performer and performance maker. So the thing that happened with that is when I did come to sound, and I came to sound through the fact that technology became really accessible, much more accessible in the mid-90s, and that somehow opened up the world to me. So I'm very much it may not always sound like it, but I'm actually quite a technologically driven sound artist, because that's how I came to be able to access it and appreciate it, I think. But I came to this with the all the passion of a recent convert. And part of this passion manifested in a kind of righteous defense against visuality initially. And that's also partly because I am not particularly skilled in the visual department in terms of drawing and things like that. And I used to go to conferences, and I'd kind of liken this to a besieged mentality in which we listeners were trapped in a world of lookers. So it's a common thing within sound artists, I think, to feel this kind of defense. And theorist Jonathan Sterne has put together a list that he calls an audiovisual litany, which summarizes the dichotomies as they're often put forward between the visual and the audible. And some of these, it's actually a very long list. This is just a small section, are the ideas that hearing immerses its subjects, while vision is often, vision offers perspective. Sound comes to us, but vision travels to its object. And hearing tends towards subjectivity and vision tends towards objectivity. Now, of course, the thing with cliches is that it's not that they are inaccurate. There's actually always a kind of seed of truth in a cliche, but it's how these truths are wielded without nuance, and that the ideas behind them actually get ground down to some sense of something flat and monodimensional. What Sterne finds problematic with these binaries is that they actually confuse cause and effect, and that he says that they elevate cultural pre-notions about the senses, or prejudices really, to the level of theory. And so as I've been, progressing through my career, I've begun to wonder how, if these unnuanced dichotomies between sight and vision are actually, sight and sound are actually helpful. And this is also particularly because in the last 5 years, I've been concentrating more on gallery-based and installation-based sound works. So I've really begun to question the value of attempting to isolate the sonic from the visual. And, it's a very pragmatic response really to the knowledge that within the world of a gallery installation, sound may be immersive, and it may very much be subjective and all these kind of spherical things, but is it going to make a gallery visitor stay in the room for longer than 30 seconds? And sadly, I think the answer is often no. Of course, context is everything, and I'm still very keen on de-emphasizing sound in particular, de-emphasizing visual aspects in particular contexts, such as in experimental listening concerts and things like this, and particularly in terms of how much performative gesture is required. But for today's purposes, I'm talking specifically about the gallery context. And so within my installation work, I've kind of dispensed with the idea of the battle of the senses, and I'm looking more towards this idea, Marshall McLuhan's idea of sensory ratios, and how within my work I can reorganize these ratios and rebalance these things, so that sound is still always at the foremost, but there's a kind of interesting relationship that's playing out between sound and vision. And so I'm just going to float two concepts that are influencing my thinking these days around how I'm working. And one of them is Don Ihde's idea of the horizon of the senses. And Don Ihde is an experimental phenomenologist. And he's got this very poetic way of talking about the relationship between the audible and the visible. And he says, and stick with me, it's kind of a slightly complex concept to deal with, but within the audible realm, if we do take it as separate just for a moment, the audible is made up of moving invisible objects. So sound waves are made up of particles of air moving, but we can't see them. And the visual realm is made up of silent, static objects. Now, the way in which the audible and the visual come together is like when the visual is heard and the audible is seen, is when a moving object comes within our field, our visible field. So sound and vision have this relationship, this connection that they make through movement, essentially. And we can think of this as their kind of connection within the center or the middle of our sensing field. But Ihde also likes to talk about the what happens on the edge of this kind of sense. So what he calls the horizon. So if we actually think about a visual horizon, the point of the horizon, beyond the point of horizon is when we can't see anything anymore. So at the very edge of the visual is invisibility. And then at the very edge of the audible, when we have reached as far as we can in terms of hearing, we get to silence. So the horizon of the audible is silence, and the horizon of the invisible, the horizon of the visual is invisibility. And what we see there is that at the horizon of one sense, it meets the essential qualities of the other. And so in this way, we can kind of think of the audible and the visual and other senses as well as not an idea of binaries and dichotomies, but actually as a continuum where there are all these different ways in which they can meet each other. The second idea I want us to think about is the idea of visual audition. And this is an idea from Michel Chion. And Michel Chion is a film theorist and has done lots of fantastic film soundtracks. And he's really interested in the different weightings of sight and sound as he works in film. And so the predominant relationship that we think about is this idea of audio vision, which preferences the vision while the audio helps us to make sense of it. And this is basically what happens with film. But there's also the option of visual audition. And this is where the auditory is the focus, but audition is influenced by the visual context that can lead to projecting certain perceptions onto it. And this is essentially what happens when we watch someone play an instrument. We don't need to see them play the instrument. We can hear what the instrument is doing, but there is something about seeing the gesture that actually adds some interesting aspect or some kind of value to it. So I'm interested in exploring the kind of visual auditive relationships within my installations and recordings. Installations and performances. I'm going to talk about two works today in a bit of detail. So the first one is my most recent project, which is a short work with a long title called A Continuous Self-Vibrating Region of Intensities. And this is a work that I have co-created with the designer fabricator Thomas Burles. And this is an idea. It was kind of inspired by the idea of cymatics, which is the visual representation of sound vibration that we can see through, like if you sprinkle powder on top of a speaker. I don't recommend you do that because it ruins your speaker, but you can see particular geometric patterns that form from different waveforms. And it also happens with liquids. So the basic principle is this idea of cymatics, but I found this very beautiful quote from Ursula Le Guin, where she says, all living beings are oscillators. We vibrate. We huge, many-celled creatures have to coordinate millions of different oscillation frequencies and interactions among frequencies in our bodies and our environments. And the idea is that, of course, vibration is actually what kind of connects us all. It's how all our matter actually exists with each other. So within the idea of cymatics, we actually came across this 19th century singer and scientist called Margaret Watts Hughes, who was the creator of an instrument called an idophone. And this image that you're seeing now here is Tom's variation of an idophone called a tridophone. So it's a three-headed idophone. And she used this she was using it basically to register the intensity of her voice, and using the powders on top of a membrane when she sang through this tube to actually see, if you get the note in its purest form, you get these very clear patterns. So we're inspired, I was inspired as a vocalist, I was inspired by the fact that there was this female pioneer of experimentation with cymatics. And so we concentrated on the idea of vocally driven cymatics, and consequently I invited experimental vocalists Carolyn Connors and Sonia Hollowell to join me in this project. So I'm actually going to show you a little bit of footage from it and stop talking for a second. The footage is about 10 minutes, it's 3 minutes long. And do that.
sa, 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 sa.
So Tom and I were quite interested in looking at a lot of 19th century technologies involved in early experiments with audiovisuality, and then thinking about how we can adapt them within this very digital age. And of course that came from, I don't really perform acoustically myself. So there are these different ways in which we either work acoustically with the instruments, or we actually deal with the ways in which we can transduce sound. But as you can see from that, sound is very much the driver of the work, but the visuality is the way in which we can actually really begin to appreciate the vibratory essences of sound. So then I'm going to talk about the work that was commissioned by Experimenta for Experimenta Make Sense. And it's a work, it was commissioned by Experimenta and Anat, I should say. And I also worked with Thomas on this one. Thomas created the infrastructure, which is mostly invisible, but it's absolutely vital, except for this kind of holographic tube that you see in front of you. So this work is called Sonolexic, and it's an installation work that is currently touring, or it's sitting in a warehouse at the moment, but will be touring. And it's based on it came out of the fact that I used to write for Real Time and write about sound quite a lot, and started writing about sound at the same time as I started making sound myself. And for me, there's this kind of very intertwined relationship between when I hear experimental sound and music, I get this instantaneous kind of stream of text that comes to me. They're somehow inextricably entwined. And I wouldn't go so far to say as there's a synesthesia, because synesthesia is a connection between sense and sense. But there is an element that happens within a synesthesia, which is called ideesthesia, which is the connection between a sense and a concept. And there's something about the kind of connection that happens with me between listening and the inner voice that immediately gets activated within me that I was interested in exploring, and that's what Sonolexic does. So in the center of a darkened room, you see this tube that I project on, and I got that text, thanks to Nikki, that I project on. And it's actually illustrating, it kind of is a visualization of the sound that you're actually hearing. The sound plays through two normal speakers in the space, but then there's also another speaker that's a hydrophonic speaker, an ultrasonic speaker, which is like a sound that travels in a very specific beam. And so you only really hear the sound clearly in a particular spot in the room, and you can only really see the image in its optimum way within a particular spot in the room. So I'm kind of using these two elements to anchor you in the space in a particular way. And so it's a very text-driven work, and it's basically exploring, it's almost like a radiophonic work in some ways, where I'm exploring ideas around orality and how text is related to sound. And I'm just going to show you a little piece of something from that. And this is about a minute, that's a minute 22, I can see that.
Some say that in the beginning was the Word. It was a heard word. But that's starting in the middle of the story. There was nothing, then the beginning. And that beginning was a noise is the most complex of sounds, all frequencies playing at equal intensity. Noise is often defined as unwanted sounds, yet there is always a signal in the noise.
So sonolexic is kind of like the aural project of my my PhD research, which I'm now undertaking, and the aspect of that project is actually called Languages of Listening, and it part of it grew out of the thing I was doing for Experimenta as part of the public program, which is a series of interviews, one-on-one interviews, where I play the participant a series of sound files and then get you to describe them back to me, and then I look for different kind of linguistic patterns in the way that people are talking about sounds, and how their relationship that they have between language and listening. And I'm continuing this, as I said, into my PhD, which is titled Languages of Listening. And I am actually in need of a few more volunteers, because I generally do this part of the project when the exhibition is on, and it's not going to be on for a while. I am seeking about 5 to 10 volunteers, and we would do the interview over Zoom. And it's actually, most people find it quite a pleasant experience, where I just play you some nice little samples and then we chat about them, and I record it and transcribe it. And from this, I've actually then made, from the other experiences of doing this, I make a little ebook called Sonolexic. This is the sonolexic version, and within that there are a whole series of small little poetic transcripts from what people have, how people have described the sounds, and also stories that they tell me about listening. And it's a kind of interesting little way of processing both this artwork and forwarding my research. So if you were at all interested in doing one of those interviews, they take about 30 minutes. And then also in terms of the transcript and those things, that's all totally negotiated. So if you didn't want it included, then that's also fine. But feel free to email me. That is my email there, and I'll put it in the chat when I get back to being able to see a chat window. Or you could also contact Experimenta if you can't find my details, and they can pass it on. But I think I will conclude it there. Thank you very much. I will stop my sharing.
Thank you, Gail.
Thank you.
And thank you, Fayen. Now, look, we've just got a little bit of time left. So for those of you out there that are listening and you have questions, if you could type them into the Q&A, I think would be helpful, or even the chat, then Fayen and Gail can respond. Just seeing if there's... Okay. It seems that it's quiet out there. They're thinking about it. Fayen, do you want to come back on the camera as well? Well, we have some congratulations from Madeline. So thank you, Maddie. Look, I think we have almost run out of time, but I am curious to sort of go a little bit further into your responses to the current situation that we find ourselves in Australia. Fayen, you started to talk about that, drawing our attention to the fact that many of these initiatives are a great way to provide access to communities that often don't have access, particularly to the gallery context. And I've certainly taken that on board in terms of what Experimenta could continue to do in the future. But I'm interested in terms of your own practices, whether it's stimulating different ideas in terms of work, or yeah, what your responses have been so far.
Shall I go first, Jonathan?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's like most people, you know, it's a difficult time. I've been a bit distracted today because, like many people, this was the first day my son was back to school via distance learning homeschool. So I was also managing a 9-year-old in the other room trying to get online, and I think that kind of dispersal of attention is something that is going to affect my practice, because it has to. I think that that's one thing. I am trying to think thoughtfully about what kind of content needs to exist. I think that one of the knee-jerk reactions that happened originally was that people flooded the internet with content, and that's led to a lot of people just sort of thinking it's overkill, it's too much, why is this stuff there? And I think that it is useful for any organization, or I'll give this pitch, to think about what is your core mission, and then how is that served, and how are audiences expanded through this process. So I'm involved with ACCA, so I'm talking with them about ways that can happen in terms of being innovative around digital publishing or online commissions, but not things that are sort of just a temporary band-aid, but something that's more meaningful. And Maddie knows, who's been really active in the chat today, that I've been trying to conceive of a virtual mentorship with her that builds on actually a virtual choreographic experiment that I've started. One element of which I've started with blind dancer Holly Craig, because of course we have no need for vision in the ways that we work together. So Holly is actually choreographing a piece for me through fortnightly online meetings, and I'm going to try and find ways of recording that. Yeah, so it's all very experimental, but there's a number of experiments that I've just started up that I think are bigger than the COVID moment and can lead to kind of more substantive work down the track.
Yeah, fantastic. And you, Gail?
To be honest, because I'm in the middle of doing my PhD, it's kind of like the only situation that isn't deeply affected. You know, like I already lived 2 hours out of Sydney, so I'm already used to kind of not being in the middle of things. And so I mean, obviously it has been very hard to concentrate, and you know, I think it's interesting watching that seep back in, watching normality come back in, and you know, getting phone calls like this one going, you know, do you want to do this thing? And so in some ways there's huge amounts of kind of practical things that I don't have to deal with in terms of commuting currently, because the whole world has now decided that we don't commute, you know, and that's, I'm teaching at UTS, and that's really interesting that, you know, like there are certain deficits that have happened because of that, but actually also I'm finding that teaching experience really interesting, and almost more interesting than what it was in terms of the kind of level of engagement that we're really asking from the students. They're actually offering it via this virtual medium, which I was quite surprised. Yeah, so I honestly can't say that at this stage, because I'm one of those people that was afraid there was way too much content out there, and I could have gone, oh, here's another album, here's a, you know, the world doesn't need everything out there at the moment. Yeah, and I'm already kind of interested in ideas of digital publishing and taking and certainly the multimedia aspects of that is everything that is involved in how we're trying to rethink things now. But yeah, nothing specific. I have to be honest at this stage. I'm in awe of Fayen's capacity to cope with the larger issues of the world, which I kind of tend to hide from. Basically, I'm hiding. That's what I'm doing up here.
Up in the mountains.
Yeah.
So Gail, Kat Jones has got a question for you about what's emerging so far from the Language of Listening project.
Yeah, interestingly, from those interviews, when I first started doing them in the context of the PhD, because I was doing them for the Experimenta project, and then I repurposed them for the PhD, I did initially go, I don't know, and also, you know, your PhD question changes and all this kind of business. For a second there, I had a moment that it was just generating more material and it wasn't particularly relevant. But actually, when I really started to sit down and process those things, there's some actually really fascinating stuff that happens around grammar, and without going into like an intense world of linguistics, because that's not my field, but I think on a kind of instinctual level there's some really interesting stuff that is coming up, and it's floating in some of the theory. Like people keep going, oh, is sound a verb, is sound a blah blah blah, but actually the recurrence of the way that people use grammar is really interesting in that. And I think particularly around ideas of presentness and the present participle, and how many ways the ing can be used when people describe sound is amazing. And that, I think that's really indicative of an essential quality of the presentness that is required in sound. Yeah, I'm finding that interesting. I'm also just finding interesting that people really like doing these interviews. I find that people don't talk about listening. They'll talk about what songs they like. They'll talk about, you know, the band or this thing, or, you know, maybe they'll pull apart a piece of music, but they don't sit down and talk to each other in detail about listening, or they'll just describe a random sound and then move on to something else. To kind of talk for half an hour and try and use your words to talk about sound is quite difficult, but also people find really rewarding. And I think there's something interesting in that relationship as well that develops. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. There's two more questions that are really big questions for you, Gail. Which
great, because I'm coming up with the big deep answers already. Yeah,
we're kind of running out of time. But look, one of those is sorry, I'm just having a read. Okay, so another one to both of you. This is from Nolan in Auckland. Do you know any online platforms that are innovating in ways to present art experiences in this online context? So that's a general one to you, and I'm just going to come back to the other question, Gail, specifically for you. A general one to both of you, Fayen.
I mean, there's a small gallery in Rotterdam called Shimmer Shimmer, which is run by Emerging Curatorial. I think they're a duo. That might be a bigger collaborative. And out of all of the things that I've seen, I have been so impressed at the thoughtfulness that they've given this. And they've done a number of things. One of them is they took rubbings of the empty seats in their gallery, and through a process of people inviting people to send their addresses, and they're cutting those up into pieces to send those out to people who are interested. And they've also commissioned a number of people, including myself, to create readings, which will be, there's sort of audiovisual readings that will be online. I think they'll start to come out soon, around ideas about intimacy and connection. So kind of going the other way. And mine is a collaboration with the Art Gallery of New South Wales conservator, Sophia Lobianco, and also a young designer, Lizzie Boone. And what that's thinking about is this really interesting moment where you know, this hypersensitivity to issues of infection and so on is shifting the way that you can think not only about tactile art, but about even conversations have a material trace in terms of droplets. So in working with this conservator about what is the science about what's actually going on, how do we re-navigate and understand intimacy in this moment? So I think there's smaller galleries out there that are doing really phenomenal things. And I also want to shout out to the radical disability justice community in the US who are doing extraordinary things that are very social justice motivated, caring for the most vulnerable, but through some, you know, and treating that as valid artistic practice. So whether it's creating e-publishing of manuals about, you know, how to survive when you don't have a ventilator or these sorts of things, I think, and validating that this is a moment where, you know, it's okay to consider that an artwork. I think these kinds of models are really interesting.
Okay. And Gail, do you have anything to add before? I think we need to wind up.
No, I've got nothing.
Okay, nothing. Okay. Hey, thank you so much to both of you for this. It's been great. Really interesting presentations. Thank you, both of you. And look forward to seeing you one day in person again.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Gail.
Thank you all.
Thank you. That was so
Thank you for
interesting. And thanks
coming.
to everybody who contributed. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. See you later.